The individual gazed at his garden in disbelief. Moisture was leaking in from outside of the wall and creating puddles of dirt in the sand. All of the ground near his fence was completely submerged in water. Did a pipe perhaps burst somewhere on the grounds? Not a single person took any action with respect to the water on the grass. Desmond Jennings, a 38-year-old man, looked out from his cooking area window and beheld the gorgeous sight of his precious garden. He had been diligently caring for it for the last 12 months, creating a miniature heaven. The vibrant hues of blooming petals and the soft whisper of foliage in the wind was calming to his spirit. Desmond was proud of his skill with saving water during his stay in Laguna Beach, California. He was a computer programmer who had the privilege of working from his house and liked to spend time in nature. As the proprietor of a flourishing, meticulously looked-after garden, he had managed to preserve its magnificence while controlling his water usage. He was unaware that his glorious garden would draw in undesired intruders. He chose to be solitary, however. His peacefulness was continually being interrupted by an apprehensive thought: the amount of money he had to pay for water. He was meticulous about his credit ranking, and his money situation was organized. On a regular basis, Desmond's water bill reached an astonishing $300. He was proud of himself for being mindful of his usage, even during the hottest months of summer. So why was his bill so high? That's not right. He was constantly distressed by the water bill, and the concern he felt deepened as time went by. He was being charged increasingly more for his water, and it was almost up to an outrageous $300. This caused him to be scared, as it could leave his planned budget in ruins. Something seemed off. He experienced the usual worries associated with being a homeowner, but on this day, his stress was amplified, as he noticed his hose had gone missing. The green spiral he used to give his plants water had vanished. He looked puzzled, trying to understand what had happened to it. He started to question if he had forgotten where he put it. Nevertheless, a feeling inside told him that something was wrong. Desmond had been living at the beautiful property for a period of 1 year, and had dedicated a lot of effort into cultivating the vibrant blossoms in his garden. Even though he was a newcomer to gardening, how could he continue to look after his garden without the correct equipment? The blossoms were not only plants, they were evidence of his commitment. Still, the impending threat of that impending water charge blocked out the cheeriest of petals. Desmond left his house and stepped into his backyard, a feeling of shock and dismay flooding through him. He couldn't believe it when he laid his eyes on the spot where his reliable hose should have been. It was gone. He was dumbfounded. It had disappeared without a trace, as if a magical creature from the garden had taken it away. His expression was full of bewilderment, until he spotted something shifting in the next yard. What was that? Desmond glanced at his environment, his attention quickly settling on his neighbor's lawn, which was enclosed by a pristine white fence. Was this what he was looking for? The elderly woman who resided beside him, Mrs. Wolowitz, was an improbable offender. Her white hair and gentle disposition gave her a kindly presence, distant from that of a person who would steal hoses. He concluded that it couldn't possibly be her. A vigilant individual kept an eye on the elderly woman from behind the barrier. She had a bulky item in her grasp and was attempting to unfurl it. Desmond's eyes widened in shock as he gawked at her. She had his hose tightly in her grasp, her thin body straining against the curled-up tube. It was her who had been responsible all this time. At that spot, Mrs. Wolowitz, a familiar face he had smiled at countless times, was standing there in her advanced age. It was plain to see what she wanted. She tightly gripped his garden hose, which was not attached to a water source, and was sending its spray onto her own garden. Desmond was appalled as he saw the liquid running onto her vegetation. He was taken aback when he saw Mrs. Wolowitz not only grab his garden hose, but also disconnect it from the faucet, dragging it through his yard into her garden. "How audacious," he whispered to himself. The elderly woman was the cause of Desmond's skyrocketing water bill each month. Desmond was extremely angry. His chest felt tight with fury. For 20 minutes, he remained in place, observing her shower her greenery as if everything was okay. The nerve she had to not even request approval and take it whenever she desired. He felt completely outraged that someone would come into his garden without warning and use his things without even saying hello. It was like an invasion of his private property. Desmond was overwhelmed by a combination of feelings: rage, shock, and a strong motivation to manage the circumstance in a way that would be an unforgettable experience for Mrs. Wolowitz. He slipped back into his house, thinking of ideas. He didn't want to just confront her because he felt the issue was too important. So he chose a more complicated and thrilling plan. He worked out a precise plan for retribution. At first, he was stunned, but then rage began to take over. Yet Desmond's ideas went in an unforeseen direction. Rather than address her head-on, he experienced an urge to do something mischievous. Thus, he planned to show Mrs. Wolowitz a lesson she would not forget easily. He thought of a cunning plan which would make her reflect twice before taking items that do not belong to her. Desmond had a sly smile on his face as he formulated an idea. He securely attached his hose to the faucet so that it could not be taken off without difficulty. She would not be able to move the hose to her area. He then quietly placed himself in a spot where he could see Mrs. Wolowitz as she walked towards his hosepipe with a self-assured attitude. What would the senior citizen do in response? She was anticipating that she would win without difficulty, but as she pulled on the hosepipe's immovable latch, her features demonstrated her strong-willed attitude. Unfortunately, her attempts were unsuccessful, and the latch stayed securely in place. Anger was etched on her face, and Desmond couldn't help but snicker a little. She searched desperately for something that would help her take off the hose. What would she do now? Mrs. Wolowitz reluctantly accepted that she could not take the hose away. Despite this, she was still determined to water her garden. After a period of thought, she strolled to the yard next door and got a hose from there. With a victorious grin, she attached it to her faucet, prepared to keep on with her custom. The elderly woman looked around without being disheartened, her gaze eventually falling on the hosepipe next to her. She went over to it with a combination of displeasure and frustration, grabbing it and pointing it at her garden with a sense of success. As she twisted the handle of the tap, a loud gurgling sound could be heard. Then, a weird dripping sound. The other nearby dweller noticed her and quickly shut off the water pump. Anger surged through her as she returned to get Desmond's hose. Mrs. Wolowitz pointed the sprayer at her face, expecting the pleasant sensation of water. The liquid shot out as she waited eagerly. To her amazement, instead of the water she was expecting, a powerful surge of thick fluid came out. Her shocked shriek reverberated around the garden as the sticky slime sprayed all over her face and clothes, leaving her stunned and completely confused. Mrs. Wolowitz looked baffled, and then, all of a sudden, water shot out from the hosepipe like a huge waterfall. Startled by the suddenness of the situation, she inadvertently pointed the hosepipe at her own face, sending a shower of water over her. With a shocked cry, she quickly let go of the hose, which then began to flail around uncontrollably. Confused, Mrs. Wolowitz immediately changed the direction of the hose towards her garden, mistakenly causing a streak of white to cover her grass, flower beds, and the exterior of her residence. She was completely taken aback when she saw paint being thrown all over her beloved garden and house. She was in a state of shock and disbelief, unable to do anything as her long cared-for plants and picturesque exterior were changed into an abstract painting of white droplets. Mrs. Wolowitz made a desperate attempt to have power again by aiming the hose at her garden, but to her surprise, the liquid that came out was not clean and refreshing like it should have been. In reality, it wasn't even water. She was taken aback as the milky-textured fluid burst out, coating her flora, garments, and also her dwelling. She yelped as she attempted to rub the muck off her mug. From his window, Desmond tried to hold back a giggle that quickly turned into a bout of uncontrollable laughter. He was pleased with how his retribution had gone. Mrs. Wolowitz was standing in the middle of her altered garden, and it was a spectacle. She had paint all over her, from her face to her clothing to her silver hair. She looked around, understanding the chaos she had caused by mistake. Amid the confusion and disarray, Desmond was no longer able to contain his amusement. It erupted from him, resonating throughout the gardens and arriving to Mrs. Wolowitz's auditory senses. She glared at him intensely. Her rage was noticeable from the window. She was waving her arms around furiously, but he didn't pay any attention. "That'll show her," he chuckled. The elderly woman's actions only made the mess worse, as the liquid blended with the paint, forming streams of faint hues that flowed down her home like a peculiar piece of art. Desmond chuckled heartily in the comfort of his house as he took pleasure in the scene before him. This was the perfect revenge for what Mrs. Wolowitz had done, and it was wonderful to observe her helplessly attempting to clean her windows with a pail and cloth. He could easily witness her frustration, even from afar. Desmond's scheme had functioned flawlessly, too faultlessly. Mrs. Wolowitz's garden had been completely painted white, giving it an uncommon, otherworldly outlook. Similarly, the elderly woman's house had been adorned with paint, transforming it into an amusing yet disorderly work of art. Desmond couldn't help but beam with joy as he surveyed the spectacle. Mrs. Wolowitz was dripping with white paint, surrounded by a mess of it in her garden, her face a combination of shock and anger. Mrs. Wolowitz had no choice but to go inside, her garden now a jumble of disarray and mess. How could she possibly fix it? She didn't have access to any water. From the window, Desmond spied the woman, her face expressing her anger and animosity. Would she seek retribution against him? Afterwards, Mrs. Wolowitz's garden was proof of the results of her behavior that were not planned. Desmond kept tending to his own garden with a feeling of contentment. The recollections of her unsuccessful endeavors and the ensuing vibrant disorder served as a reminder that now and then an intelligently planned lesson could communicate more strongly than a direct conflict. As the day ended, Desmond's anxiousness about his water bill disappeared. He felt proud and delightfully sly, knowing that he had found a clever solution to stop his neighbor from stealing his hose. Mrs. Wolowitz was taught an unforgettable lesson. Never provoke someone who loves their garden and has a talent for the unforeseen.